There is a particular tiredness that does not come from the body. You have probably felt it. It is not what happens after a long run or a hard week of physical labor or a night with very little sleep. It is quieter than those, and in some ways it is harder to name. It comes after a long period of giving time, giving attention, giving patience when you were not feeling patient, and care when you were already depleted, and loyalty that went beyond what was required. It comes after showing up before anyone asked and helping in the way you would have wanted someone to help you, and then noticing slowly over months or years that the giving did not flow back. Not one dramatic betrayal, just a slow arithmetic that does not balance. You are lying here now, and maybe that is the calculation you are running. Who you carried, who did not carry you, and why, with all the good intentions and genuine care, it keeps coming out the same way. Tonight we sit with Friedrich Nietzsche, not the Nietzsche of the internet, the hard quotes pulled out of context, the aggressive posturing, the caricature that gets printed on t-shirts, the real one, a man who gave extravagantly, in friendship and in ideas, and in years of sustained devotion, and who spent most of his adult life slowly understanding why that giving left him so deeply alone. He had a philosophy for this. It is not the one most people quote, and it is not comfortable, but it is true, and it might be the thing you need tonight, in the dark, before you sleep. Let your body settle into where it rests. Feel the surface beneath you. There is nothing required of you for the next 3 hours. Nothing to solve. Nothing to decide. We begin in Basel in 1869 with a young man who believed the world would meet what he brought to it. Chapter 2. The man who arrived with everything. The city of Basel, Switzerland in 1869. The Rhine moves through the old town in winter, grey and deliberate. The university sits on a hill. In the philology department, a chair has just been offered to a man who has not yet completed his doctorate. His name is Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. He is 24 years old. The appointment is extraordinary by any measure. Nietzsche has published essays in the field, rigorous, unusual, already carrying something that does not sound like ordinary academic prose. And the university committee has decided that the essays are enough. He accepts. He travels to Basel. He resigns his Prussian citizenship to take a Swiss residence permit, and in doing so becomes, technically, a citizen of no country at all. This is not an accident. There is something in him that prefers to belong entirely to himself. He is tall and broad-shouldered, though the migraines that will plague his entire adult life have already begun. His moustache is the feature everyone who meets him mentions first. Dark and full, already large in 1869, growing more pronounced with every passing year, until by the end of his productive life it has become almost the first thing people see. His eyes are described by everyone who spent time with him as unusually heavy, as if they were focused on something slightly further away than the room he was standing in. He has already met Richard Wagner. The meeting happened in Leipzig the previous year, at the house of Nietzsche's brother-in-law. Wagner was 55, Nietzsche was 23. They talked through the afternoon and into the evening, and something in Nietzsche recognized something in Wagner, a seriousness about ideas, a willingness to go where the thought led, an appetite for the large questions that he had rarely found in his academic peers. Wagner invited him to visit. Nietzsche went, and then went again, and again. By 1869, the friendship with Wagner is the warmest relationship in Nietzsche's life. Wagner lives at Tribschen, on a lake near Lucerne. Nietzsche visits often enough that he can walk the path from the road to the door without looking. Cosima Wagner, Richard's wife, treats Nietzsche like an intelligent, younger member of the household. There is music in the evenings and conversation, and the feeling, rare in Nietzsche's life, of being thoroughly and generously received. He has arrived in Basel, in other words, with everything he believes he needs: a position, a friendship that feels like family, ideas that are beginning to crystallize into something original, and a disposition that gives freely time, attention, intellectual labor, devotion, because that is what it means to him to be alive in the company of people he admires. He does not yet know what that disposition will cost him. Chapter 3, the first kind of tired. Let your shoulders drop. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you. Let the weight of the day release into what is beneath you. There are two kinds of tired. The first you know well. It lives in the body, in the ache of muscles used hard, in the drag behind the eyes, in the slow blurring of the room before sleep. This kind of tired has a cure: rest, 8 hours or something close to it, and you wake and the deficit is paid and the body is ready again. The second kind of tired is less simple. It lives in the part of you that has been available, not physically, available in the way that matters more and costs more. Available when someone in your life needed you. Available when a friend was struggling and you had something to give, not because you had extra necessarily, but because they needed it and you could. Available in the way that required you to hold something back from yourself in order to hand it to someone else. This kind of tired does not lift with sleep. It accumulates slowly over months or years, and it asks a different question. Not how do I recover, but why does the arithmetic keep coming out this way? You have probably seen the pattern without fully naming it. The person you helped move house who did not appear when you needed to move. The colleague you championed through a difficult period who, once the period ended, moved on as if the championing had not happened. The family member you sustained through the worst year of their life, who, once the worst year was over, found other things to occupy their attention. You did not help in order to be repaid. You know that. That is not why you did it. But you also did not expect to be left holding the weight of the giving with nowhere to set it down. Friedrich Nietzsche felt this, not occasionally, repeatedly, and in the relationships he had invested in most deeply. He did not write about it as a complaint. He wrote about it as a philosophical problem, a question about the structure of giving itself, about what happens inside the giver and inside the one who receives, and about whether there is a way to give that is not, at its deepest level, quietly asking for something in return. Tonight, we trace that question through his life and his work, all the way to the answer, which is not comfortable, but which is real. Chapter 4: The Gift-Giving Virtue. In January 1883, Friedrich Nietzsche sat in a boarding house in Rapallo on the Ligurian coast of Italy and wrote the first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra in 10 days. That is not a figure of speech. He wrote it in 10 days. The ideas had been building for years. He had been carrying Zarathustra in notebooks and fragments since at least 1881, but the writing itself came in a single intense sprint in a rented room in an Italian coastal town. In the middle of winter, he was almost completely alone. He had heard that same week that Richard Wagner had died in Venice on February 13th. He kept writing. The book opens with a man named Zarathustra, Nietzsche's prophet, his alter ego, the figure through whom he speaks most directly, who has spent 10 years alone on a mountain. He is full. His wisdom has been growing in the silence and the altitude, and one morning he wakes and decides the cup is overflowing. He must descend. He must give what he has accumulated to the people below. In the first part of the book, there is a chapter called On the Gift-Giving Virtue. It is one of the most honest things Nietzsche ever wrote about what it feels like to be the kind of person who gives. Zarathustra tells his followers that gold is the highest virtue, not because it is useful, but because it is rare and because it radiates. It gives without diminishing. The sun pours down its light all day without consulting whether the earth deserves it. The overflowing river does not wait to be thanked before it waters the valley. The gift-giving virtue Nietzsche is describing is the impulse to give that comes not from obligation or from need, but from an excess of self, from a person who is so full that fullness wants to flow. This is a very specific description of a very specific experience. You may recognize it. It is what it feels like when you help someone not because you feel you should and not because you want something in return, but simply because you have something and they need it, and the giving feels like the natural thing, the only thing to do. Here is what Nietzsche does not tell you in that chapter. He tells you that this virtue is gold. He does not tell you what happens to gold when it meets hands that cannot hold it. He does not tell you what happens to the giver when the giving is met not with gratitude, but with the simple absorption of the one who was helped, who moves on, who is now fed and therefore no longer hungry and therefore no longer here. He will tell you, we will get there. But hold this first. There are two kinds of giving. The first is the gift-giving virtue, the overflowing cup, the sun that shines without consulting the calendar. The second is something that looks very much like it from the outside, but is doing different work inside the giver. By the end of tonight, you will understand the difference, and you will probably recognize which kind has been exhausting you. Hold that gently. It returns later. Chapter 5. The Teacher He Loved. Leipzig, Germany, 1865. Friedrich Nietzsche is 20 years old. a student at the university studying classical philology, the languages and texts of ancient Greece and Rome. He is walking one afternoon through the old part of the city when he turns into a second-hand bookshop. He picks up a book he has not encountered before, The World as Will and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer. He pays for it and takes it home. For the next 2 weeks, he sleeps approximately 4 hours a night. The rest of the time, he reads. Schopenhauer has been dead for 5 years. He died in Frankfurt in 1860 at the age of 72, largely unrecognized by the philosophical establishment of his era. He was difficult, combative, and profoundly pessimistic about the nature of existence. His central argument was that beneath all appearances, beneath the world as we perceive it, with its objects and its causes and its logic, there is a single blind force he called the will. Not a personal will, not God's will, but something more like an impersonal appetite, purposeless, insatiable, driving all matter and all life toward nothing in particular. We are expressions of this will. Our desires, our ambitions, our hungers, they are the will expressing itself through us. And because the will is insatiable, satisfaction is always temporary. The relief of getting what we wanted lasts a moment. Then the wanting begins again. The young Nietzsche finds this both devastating and beautiful. Not because he agrees with the pessimism, he will eventually move decisively beyond it, but because Schopenhauer is taking the question of human suffering completely seriously, without flinching, without the consolations of religion or convention. That intellectual honesty, for a 20-year-old who has been asking the hard questions since he was a child, feels like the first adult he has encountered in philosophy. He gives Schopenhauer everything a young philosopher can give a dead teacher: his complete attention, his admiration, and his direction. He writes about him. He assigns him to students. He titles one of his early essays Schopenhauer as Educator. He loves the man through the books the way you can love someone you have never met, with the particular intensity of a person who has found, at last, the voice they were looking for. And then, slowly over years, he realizes that the love was larger than the object could bear. Schopenhauer's pessimism is not the whole truth. The renunciation of desire is not the answer. The teacher who felt like a revelation was a beginning, not a destination. This is the first instance of a pattern that will run through Nietzsche's entire life. He loves completely, he gives his full devotion, and then the thing he loved turns out to be smaller than the love. Not false, but not enough to hold what he brought to it. The body remembers the giving even when the mind has moved on to the critique. Chapter 6. What the helped cannot see. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Let your jaw soften, let your breathing move on its own. There is something the person who was helped cannot easily see about the person who helped them. This is not about ingratitude exactly. Most people who receive genuine help, substantial help, given freely, feel something like gratitude. The feeling is real, but it is also uncomfortable, because receiving significant help creates an asymmetry, and asymmetry is something the mind is built to resolve. The mind resolves it in several ways, and all of them are understandable, and none of them are quite honest. The first is inflation. The mind recasts the help as something the helper did for their own reasons. She helped because she had time on her hands. He helped because it made him feel good. The giving was not really about me, it was about them. This revision restores a sense of equality. I did not need to receive charity. I was convenient for someone else's generosity. The second is minimization. The mind quietly reduces the weight of the help. I would have figured it out eventually. It wasn't as much as it seemed. The memory of the crisis softens, and with it, the memory of what the crisis required from someone else. The third is criticism. The mind finds something to fault in the helper, or in the manner of the helping. It was given in the wrong spirit. There was something slightly condescending in how it was offered. The help was real but imperfect, and imperfection justifies some distance from the debt. Friedrich Nietzsche did not write about this as a moral failing. He wrote about it as a structural feature of how human beings manage asymmetry. We do not naturally rest in a position of sustained dependence on another person. The debt that cannot be repaid becomes in time a reason to avoid the creditor, not because the helped person is dishonest, but because the mind, in its constant effort to maintain a sense of standing, of being a person who gives as much as receives, will do whatever quiet work is available to restore the balance. The person you helped, in other words, may have needed to move on, not because they did not care, because your continued presence reminded them of something they owed and could not repay. And the mind, given the choice between settling a debt it cannot settle and quietly closing the account, will often choose the latter. This is not about you. It is about a feature of human psychology that is older than language. Nietzsche spent years trying to name it clearly enough that the naming might help. Chapter 7. Something happened in Turin. January 1889. The city of Turin, in the north of Italy. The Piazza Carlo Alberto, a broad square lined with pale buildings and arcaded walkways. The city is cold and clear in winter, the Alps visible on bright days from the hills above the town. Friedrich Nietzsche has been living in Turin for several months. He is 44 years old. By this point, most of the major work is behind him. Thus spoke Zarathustra, written between 1883 and 1885, is the work he considers the most important thing he has ever done. Beyond Good and Evil, written in 1886, is the systematic statement of his mature philosophy. On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, is perhaps the most rigorous and disturbing book in the history of philosophy, a careful excavation of where our moral values actually came from, which is not where we have been told they came from. In the final months of 1888, he has written at extraordinary speed The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, and has begun the autobiography he calls Ecce Homo, Here is the Man. He is, by every measure that matters to him at the height of his thinking. He is also almost completely alone. His eyesight has been deteriorating for years. The migraines come in waves that incapacitate him for days. He has no close companions in Turin, only a boarding house room on the Via Carlo Alberto and the letters that arrive and the letters he sends. He writes to his friend Franz Overbeck in Basel, to his mother Franziska in Naumburg, to his publisher, to occasional correspondents he has never met. He takes long walks in the afternoon when the migraines allow. He eats simply. He goes early to bed. Something happened in the street near the Piazza Carlo Alberto in the first days of January 1889. Something that contains, in a very small space, everything we will spend tonight examining about giving and receiving and the cost of carrying too much for too long. I am not going to tell you what it was yet. Hold that image, the cold square, the pale buildings, the winter light. We will return to Turin before the night ends, and by then you will understand what happened in a way you could not understand it now. Chapter 8. The Hidden Arithmetic. There is arithmetic happening inside every act of giving, and most of it is invisible to the giver. This is not a criticism. It is a description, and the description matters because the only way past the arithmetic is to see it clearly. Nietzsche was interested in the arithmetic not because he wanted to accuse generous people of being secretly selfish, but because he believed that the path to genuine giving, the gift-giving virtue, the overflowing cup, ran through a clear-eyed understanding of the lesser giving that most of us actually practice. When you help someone substantially, with your time, your money, your attention, your sustained emotional presence, something in the body registers the expenditure, not as a ledger, not consciously. You are not keeping a list. But the body knows what it has given. The nervous system tracks the output. And because the body knows, the body waits in some low and patient frequency for something to return. This is not weakness. This is biology. The social structures that kept human beings alive for hundreds of thousands of years were built on reciprocal exchange. I watch your child today, you watch mine tomorrow. I share food when I have surplus, you share when I do not. Reciprocity is not a cultural invention. It is one of the oldest and deepest mechanisms in the social nervous system. It runs below language. It was there before philosophy. The problem is not the mechanism. The problem is what happens when it meets a person who gives more than the mechanism is designed to handle. Who gives not because the arithmetic compels it, but because giving is what they are. The mechanism waits for the return. The return does not come because the giving was too large to be reciprocated in kind. And the body registers the deficit slowly, in a way the mind may not want to admit. Seneca understood this 2,000 years before Nietzsche. In his Letters to Lucilius, written in the last years of his life, he worked through the psychology of giving and receiving with a directness unusual even for him. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality, he wrote, in the context of fear, but the structure holds for gratitude as well. We intend to express gratitude, and then the moment for it passes, and the intention remains, but the expression does not arrive. The giver waits. The helped one means well. The gap between meaning and doing is where the arithmetic breaks down. Nietzsche knew Seneca's work well. He returned to it throughout his life. The Roman, who had also written about the loneliness of the generous, the man who had also discovered that wealth and influence did not protect you from the specific solitude of having given more than anyone could return. Chapter 9: Why Gratitude is Rare. In the summer of 1876, Richard Wagner opened his new festival theatre in Bayreuth. It had taken years to build. It had cost what in today's terms would be millions, funded through subscriptions from admirers across Europe. The theatre was designed to produce Wagner's operas the way Wagner believed operas should be produced. Full orchestra in a hidden pit. Perfect sightlines, darkness in the house. The first festival in August 1876 was the social event of the German cultural year. Friedrich Nietzsche attended. He had been visiting Wagner regularly since 1869, 23 visits to Tribschen in the 3 years before Wagner moved to Bayreuth. He had written his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, in 1872, and dedicated it to Wagner, who praised it enthusiastically in a letter that Nietzsche kept for the rest of his life. He had written an essay titled Richard Wagner in Bayreuth as one of his 4 untimely meditations, a long, serious work of genuine admiration that cost him significant academic credibility among his colleagues. He arrived at Bayreuth in August 1876, having given Wagner more than most people give anyone. 7 years of devoted attention, intellectual labor, advocacy, friendship, and the sacrifice of a significant portion of his professional reputation. He arrived full of what he had given. And then something contracted. The grandiosity of it. The crowd that had come not for the music, but for the celebrity, for the social occasion, for the chance to be seen at the most important cultural event of the decade. The nationalism that ran through the atmosphere, the sense that this was a German project, a German triumph, a statement about German culture and German superiority, that felt to Nietzsche like something Wagner had caught, something that had infected the late work and the public project in a way Nietzsche had not allowed himself to see when he was sitting at the piano at Tribschen, listening to Wagner play sketches and talking about ideas. He left the festival early. He cited his migraines, which were genuinely bad. But the exit was not only physical. Something had broken in the giving. If you return a gift with admiration, the next stage, Seneca tells us, is habit. The gift that becomes expected. The gratitude that becomes a customary performance rather than a felt response. By Bayreuth, Nietzsche's devotion had become something Wagner simply expected, another form of tribute from one of the many people around him. The particular quality of the giving, the years of genuine intellectual companionship, had been absorbed into the general category of Wagnerian admirers. And Nietzsche, for the first time, saw himself from the outside, saw what he had been in Wagner's world. Not an equal, not a son, not quite, a particularly useful kind of admirer. If your mind has been drifting, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here. Gratitude is rare not because people are ungrateful, but because it requires a sustained act of memory. The helped person must hold in mind the weight of what they received, the cost of what was given, and the specific quality of the person who gave it. These three things fade at different rates, and all of them fade. Nietzsche had loved Wagner with enough completeness that he had not noticed the fading. At Bayreuth, in the August heat, surrounded by the grandiose machinery of Wagner's triumph, he noticed it all at once. Chapter 10. The question beneath the question. Let your breath slow. Let your eyes rest wherever they are resting. If your mind has been following the thread of Nietzsche's life, let it rest there too. If it has been moving through its own thoughts, that is fine. Nothing tonight requires you to follow every word. Here is something I want to name clearly before we go further. We have been tracing the psychology of why people do not return what you give. The mechanism of the helped, the structure of gratitude and its erosion, the way asymmetry gets resolved by the one who was helped, all of that is real, and we will go deeper into it. But there is a question underneath that question. Not why do people fail to return what you give, but what were you looking for when you gave it? This is not an accusation. It is the most honest question Nietzsche spent years trying to ask himself, and the one he was most reluctant to answer. He gave ideas and friendship and years of sustained devotion, and he kept arriving at the same loss, the warmth of the giving, and then the cold, and then the long solitude. And eventually he began to ask, not about the people who had left, but about the part of himself that kept filling cups for people who could not hold what he poured. What do you feel in the moment of giving, before you know whether it will be returned? Not what do you expect, what do you feel? In the moment when you are helping and the helping is costing you something real, what is the quality of what you feel? For some people, the feeling is relief. The giving resolves a low-grade anxiety about whether they are useful, whether they are needed, whether there is a place for them in the lives of the people they love. The giving is not from fullness. It is from the specific discomfort of believing that unless you give, unless you have something to offer, you will not be wanted. This is not a moral failing. It is one of the most human things there is. And it is what Nietzsche eventually came to understand about himself. Hold that question. We will come back to it before the night ends. Chapter 11. Wagner and the Decade of Giving. The full accounting of the Nietzsche-Wagner friendship requires more honesty than most of the people who write about it are willing to bring. Wagner was 55 when Nietzsche first met him. Nietzsche was 23. The age gap is not incidental. For Nietzsche, whose father had died when he was 4 years old in 1849, a Lutheran pastor in the village of Rocken in Saxony, dead before Nietzsche could form a real memory of him, the warmth of the Wagner household at Tribschen was something more than friendship. It was the feeling of a room with a father in it. Cosima Wagner understood this, or at least recognized it. She wrote about young Nietzsche in her diaries, with a combination of genuine affection and the faint condescension of a woman who is used to brilliant young men orbiting her husband. He was useful, he was devoted. He ran errands, practical ones, not only intellectual. He collected subscriptions for the Bayreuth project. He proofread. He bought presents for the Wagner children at Christmas. He did all of this with the wholehearted attention of a person who has found at last a family worth giving to. The intellectual exchange was real. Wagner genuinely engaged with Nietzsche's ideas, or at least he did in the early years, in the Tribschen period, before the scale of the Bayreuth project consumed his attention. They talked about ancient Greece, about the relationship between music and philosophy, about what a culture would look like that took art seriously enough to let it reshape the way people lived. These were not trivial conversations. Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, grew directly out of them, but the exchange was not equal. Wagner took and appreciated, but in the particular way of a great man who is used to being the center of whatever room he occupies, with the assumption that the quality of attention he provided was itself a form of generosity. After Bayreuth, the gap opened. Nietzsche began to write, privately, critically, about what he called Wagner's decadence, the turn toward nationalism, toward Christianity, which Wagner had not previously emphasized, toward a kind of theatrical grandiosity that felt, to Nietzsche, like a betrayal of everything they had discussed in Tribschen. He said little of this to Wagner directly. The friendship limped on in letters with increasing awkwardness until it effectively ended around 1878, when Nietzsche published Human, All Too Human, a book that made his distance from Wagnerism unmistakable. Wagner received it. He said little about it publicly. He died in Venice on the 13th of February, 1883, without the friendship having been honestly repaired. Nietzsche heard the news and kept writing Zarathustra, but the biographers who knew him well note that he carried the loss of Wagner for the rest of his life, not with bitterness, exactly. With something closer to grief, the specific grief of a person who gave everything to a relationship and then watched the relationship reveal itself slowly to have been something smaller than the giving. He had given Wagner a decade. Wagner had given him a beginning, and a grief that became part of the philosophy. Chapter 12, Slave Morality and the Martyr. In 1887, Friedrich Nietzsche published On the Genealogy of Morals. It is a short book, 3 essays, and it is, in some ways, the most uncomfortable thing he ever wrote. Not because it is aggressive, because it is accurate. The second essay is about guilt and debt and the psychology of punishment, but the first essay is the one that matters most for tonight. It is about the two kinds of morality that Nietzsche believed were always in tension in Western civilization, what he called master morality and slave morality. The names are misleading. Nietzsche is not describing political masters and political slaves. He is describing two orientations toward value, two ways of answering the question of what is good. Master morality, as he defines it, starts from strength. It asks, what is good for me? What helps me flourish, create, act, express what I am? And from that starting point, it defines good as what flows from self-determination, and bad as whatever diminishes or weakens the self. This is not selfishness in the petty sense. It is the orientation of a person who begins with a full cup. Slave morality starts from resentment. It asks, what do the powerful have that we do not? And then it redefines the terms so that what the powerful have becomes bad and what the weak have becomes good. Strength becomes arrogance, self-determination becomes cruelty, abundance becomes excess, suffering becomes virtue, and giving, the self-abnegation of giving until there is nothing left, becomes the highest moral achievement. Nietzsche was not arguing against generosity. He was arguing against the morality that makes suffering and self-erasure into virtues in themselves. The morality that says the good person is the one who gives until it hurts and keeps giving, and then gives the hurt too. The morality of the martyr. Because the martyr does not give from a full cup. The martyr gives in order to demonstrate the giving. The martyr's generosity is inseparable from the expectation that the sacrifice will be seen, acknowledged, and eventually repaid, if not in this life, then in some other accounting. The martyr is not practicing the gift-giving virtue. The martyr is practicing the most sophisticated form of the hidden arithmetic. The person lying here tonight who runs the accounting of who they have carried and who has not been carried, I am not calling them a martyr. I am saying that Nietzsche believed the distinction between the gift-giving virtue and the martyr's giving was the most important distinction in the moral life, and that most of us, at one time or another, slide between the two without quite noticing which side of the line we are on. Chapter 13, The Lou Salome Story. Rome, April 1882. Nietzsche has been introduced by his friend Paul Rie to a young Russian woman named Lou von Salome. She is 21. Nietzsche is 37. The introduction happens in the city's churches. Nietzsche and Rie and Lou moving through Rome together over several days. Rie is already in love with her. Nietzsche, within days of meeting her, believes he has met the person he has been waiting for. Not a student, not an admirer, an equal. Someone who can think at the same altitude, who is not intimidated by the hard questions, who brings something back. He proposed marriage by letter through Rie as intermediary. Within weeks of meeting her, she refused. He proposed again at Lake Orta in May. She refused again. She and Rie made plans to move to Berlin together to pursue a shared intellectual life. Nietzsche was not part of those plans. He received the news in the summer. The letters he wrote in that period to Rie, to Lou, to his friend Overbeck are some of the most raw he ever wrote. The handwriting changes. The sentences are shorter and less controlled. He describes, in one letter, a period of several days in which he could not leave his bed. And this is a man accustomed to forcing himself up through migraines that would have incapacitated most people entirely. There is a photograph from that spring taken near Turin on Monte Sacro that is now famous. Lou sits in a small cart. Rie and Nietzsche stand in front of the cart, pulling it with ropes while Lou holds a small whip. It was Lou's idea, a playful staging. Nietzsche is smiling in the photograph. The smile is real. He did not yet know what the summer would bring. He called Lou privately, in notes that were not meant to be published, the highest human being he had ever met. He was convinced that the project of the philosophy, the ideas he had been building for years about how a person could live more fully, more honestly, more self-determinedly, required this kind of companionship to reach its maturity. Not because he was dependent. He was not someone who required agreement, but because genuine philosophical thinking needs someone who can push back at the right altitude. Lou was that person, and she chose Rie and moved to Berlin and did not return. What Nietzsche did with that loss is the most important thing about it. He went to Rapallo in January 1883, alone, in a rented room on the Ligurian coast in winter, and he wrote Zarathustra, the book in which a man descends from a mountain to give his wisdom to people who cannot quite receive it. The connection is not incidental. Chapter 14, What the Body Remembers After Giving. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the surface beneath you. If you are lying in bed, feel the mattress or the pillow. Feel where the body makes contact. This is a good thing to notice. The body is always here. It has been here all day. Even when you were in your head, the body keeps its own account of giving. Not in words. The body does not work in words, but in the gradual changes of tension and fatigue, and the particular kind of weariness that is not physical in origin, but settles in the body, because there is nowhere else for it to go. You have probably noticed this. After a long period of being the person who helps, who shows up, who gives the benefit of the doubt and then gives it again, the body develops a characteristic posture. Shoulders that do not fully release. A jaw that holds something. Shoulders that rise toward the ears without permission. A breath that is shorter than it used to be. Nietzsche's body knew this. He wrote about it obliquely in his letters, the connection between the physical wreckage of his migraines and the emotional costs of the years in which he was most extravagantly giving of himself. The worst years for the headaches were the years of Wagner. The years when he was most fully invested in a relationship that was slowly revealing itself to be incapable of holding what he brought. This is not to suggest that Nietzsche's illness was purely psychosomatic. He had a complex neurological history that preceded Wagner and outlasted him. But the body and the giving are not separate. They share a nervous system. What costs the self costs the body, and the cost is often paid late. The specific texture of the body's accounting is different for different people. For some, it is restlessness, the inability to lie still, the mind returning compulsively to the inventory. For some, it is the opposite, a flatness, a tiredness so deep that movement itself feels effortful. For some, it is the particular alert and awake at 3 a.m. quality the body sitting up in the dark to do the arithmetic it could not get to during the day. Wherever you are now in that range, the body is not wrong to be doing what it is doing. It is doing its job. It is trying to process what the mind has not fully processed yet. It will do it better once it knows what it is working with. Nietzsche gave it something to work with. That is what we are here for tonight. Chapter 15. Zarathustra descends. The first chapter of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is called Zarathustra's Prologue. It is a very short piece of prose, and it is one of the stranger things in 19th century philosophy. Zarathustra has been alone on a mountain for 10 years. He wakes one morning and speaks to the sun. He thanks the sun for its patience, and then he says, "I want to give away and distribute until the wise among men grow happy once again in their folly, and the poor once again in their riches." He descends into the valley. He finds a forest. He meets an old hermit who asks where he is going, and Zarathustra explains that he is going to mankind to bring his gifts. The hermit shakes his head. He has tried this himself, he says. He suggests that Zarathustra stay in the forest and go to the animals, who love you more readily than men do. Zarathustra leaves the hermit and continues down. He reaches a town. In the market square, a crowd has gathered to watch a tightrope walker perform. Zarathustra climbs onto something to address the crowd and begins to speak about what he has brought, the idea of the overman, of a human being who goes beyond what we have settled for. The crowd is not hostile exactly. They are distracted. The tightrope walker is more interesting. They heckle. They want entertainment, not philosophy. Then the tightrope walker falls and dies. The crowd disperses. Zarathustra is left alone with the body. What Nietzsche is doing in this opening is the most autobiographically honest thing he ever attempted. He is writing about the experience of arriving with something real to give and finding that the conditions for receiving it do not exist. Not because the people below are malicious. Because they are human, they have other concerns, other entertainments, other things that are more immediately relevant to their lives than the gift a man has carried down from a mountain. The first lesson of Zarathustra's descent is not about the crowd, it is about Zarathustra. The gift-giving virtue, Nietzsche is arguing, cannot be practiced as a one-time delivery. You cannot carry wisdom down from the mountain, hand it to the market, and return to the summit empty-handed and satisfied. The giving is not an event, it is a practice. And the practice must survive the discovery that most of what you give will not be received in the way you brought it. Zarathustra does not give up after the market square. He keeps walking. He keeps giving, in smaller increments, to the people who can receive small increments. He does not stop giving. But he stops expecting the crowd to receive what only a single person in a single moment of readiness can receive. Chapter 16. The First Echo. If your mind has drifted, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here. This is the part I wanted you to hear. We planted a question in the 4th chapter tonight. The two kinds of giving. One from fullness, one from something else. This is where we begin to name the something else more precisely. The giving that exhausts the giver, and that tends to end in the arithmetic of who returned what. This is giving that comes at its root from a need to be needed. This is not a cruel description. Being needed is one of the most powerful human experiences. It is not trivial. It is the feeling of mattering in a specific way that is almost impossible to replicate from the inside. A person can tell themselves they are valued, they are capable, they have something to contribute, but the feeling of being needed by someone in a moment of genuine need is different from all of that. It is external validation that the self is necessary, not just good. Necessary. The giver who gives from this place is not a bad person. They are a person who has found a reliable source of the feeling of mattering and who returns to that source because the feeling is real and the world inside without it is quieter and less certain. They help because helping confirms that they exist in a way that is important to someone. And they help again and again. And the helping becomes the mechanism by which they maintain their sense of place in the world. What this giving cannot survive is the helped person becoming self-sufficient, or moving on, or simply needing something different. Because when the needing stops, the giving as necessity also stops. And the giver is left with the question they have been avoiding by staying busy with the helping. Who am I when there is no one who needs what I have to give? Nietzsche spent years trying to answer this question honestly. Not about other people, about himself. The giving to Wagner, to the students at Basel, to the readers he imagined for the books that almost no one read, there was in all of it a layer of need that the philosophy eventually forced him to examine. The gift-giving virtue, as he finally understood it, is what remains when you subtract that need. What is left when you give not because you need to be needed, but because giving is what you are, regardless of whether it is received, regardless of whether the person knows what they have received, regardless of whether you are ever thanked. That version of giving cannot be exhausted by ingratitude, because it was never waiting for gratitude in the first place. Chapter 17. Why the helped cannot help. There is a simpler answer to the question of why those you help cannot help you back, and Nietzsche arrived at it with some difficulty because it is not the answer his pride wanted. The simplest answer is capacity. The person who needed what you had to give needed it precisely because they did not have it. The help you provided, whether it was practical, financial, emotional, or some combination of these, was available from you and not from them, because you had developed the capacity and they had not. This is not a judgment of their character. It is a description of their situation. You cannot draw water from an empty well. You cannot ask someone to carry your weight who does not have the strength. And you cannot expect the person you help through a crisis to help you through a similar crisis, because the crisis they needed help with was, at least in part, evidence of a specific limitation that the help did not necessarily address. They got through the crisis. The limitation may still be there. Nietzsche put this differently and more sharply. He argued that the expectation of reciprocity is itself a kind of error in understanding the nature of giving. If you give water to someone who is thirsty, you do not expect to receive water in return. When you are thirsty, you look for a different well. But we treat emotional and relational giving differently, and we expect the person we helped through a hard time to have been somehow enlarged by the experience of being helped, to have grown into the capacity for the kind of help they received. Sometimes this happens. Often it does not. The experience of being helped does not automatically transfer into the capacity for helping. This is not a comfortable observation, but it is a useful one. The person who gives from a full cup, from the gift-giving virtue as Nietzsche describes it, does not expect the helped person to become a helper in the same proportion. They give because they have it to give. If the helped person gives back, that is a gift they receive with gratitude. If not, the giving itself was already complete at the moment of the giving. The reason this is so difficult to practice is that most of us, as we discussed in the earlier chapters, are not entirely giving from fullness. We are giving from a mixture, some fullness, some need, and some of the quiet arithmetic that the body is keeping even when the mind is not consulting it. Recognizing the mixture is not a defeat. It is where the honest work begins. Chapter 18. Sils Maria, 1881. The village of Sils Maria sits in the Upper Engadin Valley in the Swiss Alps at an altitude of about 1,800 meters. In summer, it is green and cool, surrounded by lakes and mountain passes and the particular silence of high places. In winter, it is buried in snow and almost empty of visitors. Friedrich Nietzsche first went there in 1881 and returned every summer he could manage until 1888. He walked for hours every day when he was there. The walks were partly medical, the migraines were better at altitude, or at least different, and partly the condition under which he thought best. Many of his notebooks from the Sils Maria periods are less written than walked, ideas caught on the path, recorded in the shorthand of someone who does not want to break the rhythm by stopping fully. In August 1881, on a walk along the shore of Lake Silvaplana, he stopped by a large pyramidal block of stone near the hamlet of Surlage. He stood there for a while. Later he wrote in his notebooks, 6,000 feet beyond man and time. What came to him at that stone was the idea of the eternal recurrence. He developed it in various places over the following years, in The Gay Science, in 1882, in Zarathustra, in Private Notes, but the core of it can be stated simply. What if you had to live your life again, exactly as you have lived it, in every detail, an infinite number of times? Every decision, every loss, every moment of difficulty, and every moment of grace recurring eternally without change. This was not offered as a factual claim about time. Nietzsche knew perfectly well it was not physics. It was offered as a test, a thought experiment that forces the question, Do you love your life as it actually was? Not as you wish it had been. Not the version with fewer losses and better decisions and people who stayed as it was. With the losses included. With the people who left included. With the giving that was not returned included. If you can say yes to the life as it was, including all of that, then you have arrived at what Nietzsche called amor fati, the love of fate. Not approval of fate, not gratitude for the pain, but the refusal to split yourself from your life by wishing it had been different, the integration of the life as lived into the self that lived it. He found this idea at a stone beside a lake, alone, in the Alps in August. He was 36 years old. He had already lost Wagner, already lost Schopenhauer as a philosophical father, already given more than most people give in a lifetime. He was about to meet Lou Salome and give again, and lose again. But the idea he found at the stone would eventually be the thing that made all the losing livable. Chapter 19. Frankl and the Economics of Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a Viennese psychiatrist who was deported to Auschwitz in 1942. He was there and in other camps until the liberation in 1945. He lost his wife, his parents, and his brother to the camps. He survived. In the camps, Frankl observed something that he later wrote about with great precision. The people who survived, not physically, not all of them, but psychologically, tended to be the people who had found a way to give, even in conditions designed to eliminate everything that made giving possible. They gave comfort to people in worse condition than themselves. They shared food they could not afford to share. They held dying strangers through the night because holding was something they still had to give. Frankl was not observing selflessness in the sentimental sense. He was observing something structural. He observed that the act of giving, the turning of the self outward toward another person, even at a cost, preserved something in the giver that the camp was designed to destroy. A sense of agency, a sense of choice. The knowledge that even in conditions of absolute material deprivation, there remained something the self could do, could offer, could be. He wrote later about this. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. The giving in the camps was not from a full cup. No one had a full cup. It was giving from an almost empty cup that refused to declare itself empty. And what it preserved in the giver was not primarily the feeling of being appreciated or reciprocated. Appreciation and reciprocation were not available in those conditions. What it preserved was the sense of being the kind of person who gives. Identity. The self as giver, regardless of whether the giving returns anything. Nietzsche would have recognized this immediately. The gift-giving virtue, as he describes it in Zarathustra, is not about the outcome of the giving. It is about the nature of the giver. The sun pours down its light not because the earth has earned it. It pours because that is what the sun is. What Frankl adds to Nietzsche's account is the extreme case that proves the rule. Even when every external reason to give has been removed, when the giving cannot possibly serve any rational purpose of self-preservation. When there is nothing left to give and nothing to receive, the giving that comes from identity, rather than arithmetic, still serves the giver. It keeps something alive in them that the arithmetic cannot keep alive. Chapter 20. When help becomes a claim. This chapter is the uncomfortable one. It requires a particular kind of honesty, and I ask you to bring it with a soft hand, not as accusation, but as observation. There is a form of helping that is a form of control. It is the most sophisticated form, and it is the hardest to see in yourself because it wears the face of generosity so completely that even the helper usually believes in the generosity sincerely. It works like this. The helper provides something the helped person genuinely needs. Not reluctantly, genuinely, with real care, real investment. And as the helping accumulates, a subtle claim accumulates with it. The claim is never stated explicitly. It does not need to be. It communicates itself through the texture of the ongoing relationship. I have given you so much that your choices are no longer entirely your own. Your choices reflect on the investment I have made. Your direction, your gratitude, your loyalty, these are owed, not in the abstract, but in the specific. The parent who says, "After everything I have done for you," this is not necessarily a manipulative person. It is often a person who gave genuinely and then discovered, when the child grew into independence, that the giving had been carrying a hidden weight, the expectation of a specific return, not in kind, but in the shape the child's life would take. The friend who helps extensively and then feels betrayed when the helped friend makes choices they were not consulted on. The colleague who mentors and then feels injured when the mentored person advances beyond the mentor. These are not villains. They are people who gave from a place that mixed genuine fullness with the hidden arithmetic, who gave real care and also, beneath the care, a quiet ledger. Nietzsche wrote about this in Beyond Good and Evil under a different name. He called it the will to help, a disposition that is partly about the helped and partly about the helper's need to maintain a position of indispensability. The person who is always the one who helps never has to be the one who is helped, never has to be vulnerable, dependent, in need. The helping is a way of staying above the line, above the arithmetic, above the position of owing. He was describing himself as much as anyone else. If you recognize something in this, and you may not, and that is fine, bring it gently. The recognition is not a condemnation. It is information about where the midnight arithmetic comes from, and information is useful. Chapter 21, Master Morality and the Free Gift. Let your body settle. Let your breath move on its own. What Nietzsche called master morality is not the morality of dominance or cruelty or disregard for others. It is the morality of self-origination, of a person who does not need to locate their goodness in comparison to others, in the suffering of sacrifice, in the ledger of who gave what to whom, who is good, in their own terms, from the inside out. The free gift, the gift that is genuinely free, that asks nothing, that carries no hidden arithmetic, comes from this place. It comes from a person who gives not because they need to be needed, not because they are afraid of what they would be without the giving, and not because they are keeping score. They give because they have something, and someone can use it. When the giving is over, it is over. There is no outstanding debt in their accounting. The act is complete at the moment of the act. This is the hardest thing to practice because it requires a genuine fullness, a self that does not need the recipient's response to know that it has value. And most of us, at most moments, are not operating from that fullness. We are operating from a mixture, as discussed earlier in the night. And the mixture is not a moral failure, it is the honest condition of being human and needing to be loved. The movement toward the free gift, toward the gift-giving virtue that Zarathustra describes, is not a sudden transformation. It is a direction, a gradual reorientation of what the giving is for. Not for the recipient's gratitude, not for the warmth of being needed, but for the simple fact that this is what you have to give, and giving it is what you are. Nietzsche arrived at this understanding the hard way. Wagner left, Lou Salome left, readers did not come. The philosophy he gave most of his life to building was absorbed by almost no one in his lifetime. And he kept writing, kept thinking, kept going in the small rented rooms of Italian and Swiss boarding houses, often alone and always in physical pain. Not because he needed an audience. He needed an audience, the letters make that clear. The longing for readers and interlocutors and people who could receive what he was giving. But the writing continued when the audience did not come. The sun does not stop shining because the earth does not send a thank you. That is the standard, not the easy standard, the one he was pointing toward. Chapter 22, The Letters. From the mid-1870s onward, Nietzsche's most consistent form of human connection was the letter. He wrote them constantly, to his friend Franz Overbeck in Basel, to his sister Elizabeth in whatever country she was currently living in, to his mother Franziska in Naumburg, to his publisher, to correspondents he had never met in person. He wrote with great care. Even to people who replied slowly or inadequately, he wrote with great care. Overbeck is the figure worth knowing here. He was a professor of theology at the University of Basel, a gentle, serious man who did not share Nietzsche's philosophical positions, but who loved him in the particular way of a person who has decided that friendship is prior to agreement. He visited Nietzsche when he could. He corresponded regularly. He worried increasingly as the 1880s went on and the letters began to change. A letter is itself a form of giving. You put something of yourself into it, attention, time, the effort of expressing what you actually think rather than what is convenient to say. And you send it into a silence, and you wait. Sometimes the reply comes. Sometimes it is adequate. Sometimes you receive less than you sent. The letter as a form tells you something about the nature of giving that other forms do not. When you give face-to-face, there is immediate feedback, a face responding, a body adjusting, a conversation that meets what you bring. The letter gives into the absence of all of that. You write your best thinking into a piece of paper and put it in an envelope and send it toward a person who is not in the room. You have no control over when or whether they open it, whether they read it carefully, whether they carry it with them or discard it. This is very close to what Nietzsche was doing with the books. He was writing letters to an entire culture in the form of books, and the culture was not opening them. The reading of Nietzsche's letters from the late 1880s is a study in what sustained giving looks like when the return has become almost entirely theoretical. He writes with intelligence and warmth. He reports small pleasures, the light in Turin, a particular restaurant on a particular street, the pleasure of walking in a city he has come to love. He asks after Overbeck's health and work with genuine interest. He is not performing wellness, he is practicing it, in the only form that was available to him. The giving, by this point, is nearly unconditional. There is nowhere left for the arithmetic to run. Chapter 23, Amor Fati and the People Who Left. In The Gay Science, published in 1882, Nietzsche wrote about what he called amor fati, the love of fate. He returned to it in Ecce Homo, the autobiography he wrote in 1888, where he said that this was the formula for his philosophy, that he wanted nothing to be different, that he did not want to look backward, that he did not want to look forward into some imagined better situation, but that he wanted to learn to love whatever is and was and will be, not to endure it, but to love it. This is not the same as approving of everything that happened. Nietzsche was not pretending that Wagner had been a good friend, or that Lou Salome had not broken something in him, or that the philosophical isolation of his adult life had been comfortable or easy. He was not pretending. He was arguing for a different relationship with the past than the one that produces the midnight arithmetic. The midnight arithmetic is, at its heart, a quarrel with what happened. The replay of the situation in which you gave generously and were not returned. The alternate version, in which the person behaved differently, recognized what you gave, responded in kind. The ledger is not just a record, it is an argument. It says, "This should have gone differently. You should have received what you gave. The balance should have been restored." Amor Fati says something different. It says, "It went as it went. The person who could not carry you did not carry you. The warmth you put into the relationship that ended cooled when the relationship ended." This is what happened. And this happened to me, Friedrich Nietzsche, who spent years in small rented rooms in Italy writing philosophy that no one read, who lost the greatest friendship of his life at Bayreuth, who proposed to a woman who chose another man, who gave his health to the work and received almost no response. This happened. I would not have it not have happened, because this is the life that produced the work, and the work is what I am. You cannot practice amor fati without something to apply it to. The losses are not incidental to the formula. They are the material of it. If your mind has been drifting, come back gently. We are still here. The hardest part of tonight is behind us. Chapter 24. Seneca on ingratitude. Lucius Annaeus Seneca writing in Rome in the 1st century, spent a great deal of his late work on what he called ingratitude, not as a character flaw in particular individuals, but as a structural feature of human social life that any thoughtful person had to account for. His extended essay on benefits is the most sustained treatment of giving and receiving in the ancient world. It runs the 7 books and addresses with systematic honesty every way that the giving relationship can go wrong, and how the giver must understand each of them in order to give freely. The central observation of On Benefits is simple and unwelcome. Gratitude is rare because it is hard. Not because people are ungrateful in their hearts, but because the expression of gratitude requires you to hold in sustained attention something that is uncomfortable to sustain attention on. The fact that you needed something that you could not provide for yourself, and that someone else provided it. The self prefers to be self-sufficient. The self prefers to be the one who gives. Holding the position of receiver with full acknowledgement of what you received and what it cost the giver requires a kind of humility that must be practiced deliberately, because it does not come naturally. Seneca's advice for the giver is not to stop giving. His advice is to understand the nature of the gift correctly before giving it. A benefit, he says, is not a loan. It is not a contract. It is not a deposit from which you can later make a withdrawal. When you give a benefit, you relinquish control over its return. If you are not prepared to relinquish that control, you are not giving a benefit. You are making a loan and calling it a gift. The giver who has genuinely given a gift, who has let go of the giving at the moment of giving, who has released the return, can never be deprived of the gift by ingratitude. Because the gift is complete at the moment of giving, the ingratitude of the receiver changes nothing about what the giver gave. This is Seneca. But it is also Zarathustra, and it is also, eventually, what Nietzsche understood about his own giving. Once the losses had accumulated enough that there was nothing left to hope for in the way of reciprocation, and he had to find another basis for continuing. The giving that is complete at the moment of giving, not after the thanks arrive. At the moment. We are not there yet. We will get there. Chapter 25. The soldier who returns empty-handed. If your mind has been drifting, come back. Settle where you are. We are past the halfway point tonight. The harder ideas are behind us, and the rest of the walk is downhill. There is a figure that appears in different forms in different cultures. The person who has been giving in the field for so long that when they return to ordinary life, they have nothing left to offer the people who waited. The soldier who comes home from a long war. The doctor who has been in crisis mode for months. The caregiver who has sustained someone through a long illness. The parent who has held everything together through years of difficulty. They return, or the crisis ends, and the people around them expect them to be available now, to give, to engage, to reciprocate the waiting, and they have nothing. The cup is empty. Not the willingness, the capacity. This is the giver who gave from fullness until there was no fullness left, who gave beyond the sustainable limit, who was not practicing the gift-giving virtue, because the gift-giving virtue cannot be depleted in this way. The sun does not run out of light, but a person can run out of what they have been spending. The distinction matters for tonight. Nietzsche was not ultimately this figure. He gave consistently, and the giving was costly. But he did not stop thinking or stop writing until the very end. The emptiness that came for him came from something different, from the sustained asymmetry of giving into near silence, not from overspending what he had. But the figure of the returning soldier illuminates something. The person who is lying here tonight running the arithmetic, are you depleted from overspending, from giving beyond your sustainable capacity? Or are you depleted from the specific quality of receiving nothing back? These are related but different. The first is about rest and boundary and the recognition that the cup has limits. The second is about the harder philosophical question: what do you give for, if not for the return? Both are real. Both have their own work to do. The soldier who returns empty-handed needs rest. That is the most important thing. Not philosophy, not reframing. Rest. The person who gave sustainably but received nothing, they need something different. They need what the rest of tonight is about. Chapter 26, What You Have Been Carrying. Let your breath slow. Feel the weight of your body. The mattress, the floor, the pillow. Let the weight go into the surface. You have been carrying something for a long time. Not the weight of tonight's ideas, but the actual weight. The one you brought here before we started. We planted a question in the 10th chapter, the question beneath the question. Not why the people you gave to could not give back, but what you were looking for in the giving. Here is where we return to it, before the resolution. The weight you are carrying tonight, the one that runs the arithmetic at 2 a.m., what is it made of? Not abstractly, specifically. It is probably not a single event. It is probably a pattern, a type of situation that has recurred. A type of person you give to, a type of giving you provide, a type of loss that follows. And underneath the pattern, if you are willing to look at it, not tonight, but when you are ready, there is probably something about what the giving was providing for you that the losing of the recipient also took away. Not the guilt of the ungiven gift, not the bitterness of the unreciprocated generosity. Underneath those, what it felt like to be the person who was giving, needed, present, purposeful, the kind of person who does this kind of thing, and what it felt like when that stopped. Nietzsche, when he finally stopped giving to Wagner, stopped giving to Lou Salome, stopped expecting his books to be received, when the giving as needing to be needed finally ran out of recipients, he was left with the question of what he was without all of that. Who Friedrich Nietzsche was, when there was no one to be useful to. What he found in the space of that question was the work itself, not the work as proof of his worth, not the work as something he was building toward recognition, the work as what he was, the thinking as what he did, because thinking was what he was. The weight you carry is real. It is also information. It is pointing at something about what the giving has been doing for you, and therefore at what you would need to develop in yourself if the giving stopped producing what it has been producing. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. It is useful. Chapter 27. The will to power as self-containment. The phrase will to power has probably done more damage to the understanding of Nietzsche than any other phrase he used. It has been pressed into service for ideas that are almost exactly the opposite of what Nietzsche meant, for aggression, for domination, for the crude appetites of the bully. What Nietzsche meant by the will to power was self-mastery, the capacity to be the source of your own values, your own direction, your own sense of what matters, without requiring external validation to sustain that sense. The will to power, as he develops it, is the antidote to the midnight arithmetic. It is what makes the gift-giving virtue possible. Here is the connection. The person who gives from need, from the need to be needed, from the need to maintain a position of indispensability, from the need for the warmth of being chosen, is operating from a deficit. The giving is a strategy for managing the deficit. And because it is a strategy, it is vulnerable to the managed condition changing. When the recipient becomes self-sufficient, or leaves, or simply stops needing, the strategy fails and the deficit is exposed. The person who gives from the will to power, who is self-contained, who does not require the recipient to confirm their worth, is not vulnerable to the same failure. They give because they have something and they choose to give it. The choice comes from inside. When the giving ends, they are not depleted in their identity. They remain themselves. This sounds like the fantasy of the person who never needs anyone. That is not what Nietzsche was describing. He had tremendous need for connection. His letters make that clear. The longing for readers, for companions, for a Lou Salome who could think at his altitude, these needs were real, and he did not pretend otherwise. The will to power is not the absence of need. It is the capacity to choose what to do with the need rather than being entirely controlled by it. The capacity to give and to receive, and to hold the giving and the receiving within a self that does not collapse when either one changes. He was working toward this his entire life. He was not always there, but the direction of the work was clear. The person who has cultivated this is the person who can give freely, who can love freely, who can lose and continue. Not because they are unaffected, but because they have become the source of their own continuity. Chapter 28, You. This chapter is for you directly. Not for Nietzsche, he is the guide but not the subject. Not for the philosophy in the abstract, for the specific person lying in this specific dark, carrying the specific weight they brought here tonight. You have been giving. This is clear from the fact that you are here, that this title found you, that the question of giving and receiving is something you are still working through at this hour. People who have never given extensively do not lie awake with the arithmetic. The arithmetic only runs when there was real giving to account for. You gave something real to someone, maybe several someones, who could not return it. And you are still here, which means the giving was worth something to you even in the absence of the return. Otherwise, you would have stopped. You would have found another way to spend your capacity. The fact that the arithmetic runs at all means the giving mattered. Nietzsche would say, that is not nothing, that is, in fact, everything. The giving that costs you something and that you would do again even knowing the outcome, that is the gift-giving virtue. Not the comfort, not the reciprocation, the choosing to give from what you have. The question he eventually stopped asking was, why did they not return it? He arrived, slowly and at great cost, at a different question. What does it mean about me that I gave it? Not as self-congratulation, as honest inquiry, as the question that leads from the arithmetic toward something larger than the arithmetic. What it means is this: you are someone who gives. That is what you are. The people who received and moved on did not take that from you. The giving was not a transaction that they failed to close. It was an expression of what you are. And what you are is not changed by the outcome. This is not easy to hold. It will not make the arithmetic stop tonight. But it is the direction. The sun does not ask the earth to confirm that the light arrived. Chapter 29, Turin again. We are back in Turin, the 3rd of January, 1889. The cold square, the pale buildings, the arcade. It is early morning. Nietzsche is walking. He has been in better spirits this winter. The letters from the previous months suggest a kind of lightness, a pleasure in the city, in the particular quality of the Turin light. He has been writing at extraordinary speed and with what he describes as a clarity he has never felt before. The letters from late 1888 have a warmth and humour that his correspondence had not always carried. On the morning of January 3rd, in a street near the Piazza Carlo Alberto, he sees a horse being whipped by a coachman. The horse is standing, the coachman is hitting it. Nietzsche ran to the horse. He threw his arms around its neck. He wept. He held the horse and wept in the street. He was carried back to the boarding house. His landlord, Carlo Alberto Fino, helped him to his room. In the following days he sent letters, some incoherent, some grandiose, some tender. He sent one to Burckhardt, the historian, that began, "I was Prado, I was also the father of Prado." He signed one Dionysus, he signed another the Crucified. Franz Overbeck received a letter on January 6th and recognized immediately that something was wrong. He traveled to Turin on his own money, arriving on January 8th. He found Nietzsche in the boarding house, confused but calm. He sat beside him on the sofa. He quietly began to sing a favorite piece of music. Nietzsche wept and leaned against him. Overbeck took him home to Basel. The doctors there could not determine the cause. Nietzsche was eventually moved to an asylum in Jena and then home to his mother in Naumburg. He never recovered his cognitive function after Turin. He lived for 11 more years, cared for first by his mother and then, after her death, by his sister Elizabeth. He died in Weimar on the 25th of August, 1900. He was 55. This is not the story of a man destroyed by giving too much. His collapse had neurological causes that remain debated. There are multiple plausible diagnoses, and the historical record is incomplete. But this is the story of a man who gave the work of his life into near silence, who sustained 20 years of philosophical labor in conditions of increasing physical pain and isolation, who gave his finest thinking to an era that was not yet ready to receive it, and who was still, in the weeks before Turin, writing letters that spoke of the city and its light and the pleasure of a walk in the December afternoon. What the horse scene contains is not the sum of the philosophy, but it contains something about what happens to a person who has been carrying weight alone for a very long time. The compassion did not collapse at Turin. It broke open. That is what you are carrying tonight. Not the collapse, the compassion that has not yet broken open into something it can rest in. Chapter 30. What the breakdown teaches. Let your breath slow. If you are still awake, this is the part I wanted you to hear. The Turin collapse does not prove that Nietzsche was wrong about giving. It does not invalidate the gift-giving virtue, or the amor fati, or the will to power as self-mastery. These ideas stand on their own terms, tested against other thinkers and against the hard facts of how human beings actually live. What Turin teaches, if we approach it carefully, without dramatizing it, and without reducing a complex human being to a symbol, is something about the gap between knowing and receiving. Nietzsche knew, as well as any philosopher ever has, what it would look like to give freely, without the hidden arithmetic, without the need for return. He had worked out the philosophy of it over 20 years. And he was also a person who had given enormously and received very little back, and who carried the specific loneliness of someone whose thinking was 20 years ahead of its reception. He was not only the philosophy, he was also the person who had lost Wagner and Lou Salome and the Basel professorship and the eyesight and most of the physical health, and who had gone on writing anyway. And the person under all of that was, it turns out, still human in the most vulnerable way. The gap between what you know and what you have actually integrated, the gap between the philosophy of giving freely and the day-to-day experience of giving from a self that still carries all the old arithmetic, this gap is not a failure. It is the human condition. It is the work. Nietzsche closed some of that gap over his productive life, more than most people close. He arrived at something real when he arrived at amor fati, at the eternal recurrence, at the gift-giving virtue as a practice rather than an aspiration. But he remained Friedrich Nietzsche, the person with the migraines and the terrible loneliness and the need for the companions who did not come. The philosophy does not promise to remove the need. It offers a way of carrying it that is less likely to break you. That is honest. It is enough. Chapter 31. The two kinds of givers. We planted a question in the 4th chapter. There are two kinds of giving, and by the end of tonight you would understand the difference. Here is the difference. The first kind of giving comes from a deficit, not a moral deficit, a structural one. A place in the self that does not feel complete unless it is in the process of giving something, being useful to someone, occupying the position of the one who provides. This kind of giving is real giving. The help is real, the care is real, the investment is real. But it is also, underneath the care, a management strategy for the specific discomfort of the giver's own incompleteness. The giving quiets the discomfort. When the recipient leaves, or recovers, or moves on, the discomfort returns, and the giver is left in the small hours running the arithmetic. The second kind of giving comes from fullness, from the experience, not always available but available sometimes, of having something and choosing to give it without needing the giving to confirm anything about yourself. The help is given and then it is complete. There is no outstanding account. If the recipient flourishes, you are glad. If they move on without acknowledgement, you are disappointed but not emptied. If they forget what was given, you remember it, and the memory is sufficient. Most people who give generously give from both kinds, in varying proportions, at varying times. This is the honest condition. It is not a reason for shame. It is the material with which the more honest and ultimately more sustaining practice is built. The movement from the first kind to the second kind is not a change of personality, it is a gradual reorientation. It happens when you have been emptied enough times by the hidden arithmetic that you finally become curious about what would be left if you stopped expecting anything back. What you would be if the giving were complete at the moment of giving. Nietzsche spent 20 years making this movement. He never completed it, no one does. But the direction of his work was clear, toward a giving that did not need the return to justify itself, because the giving was an expression of what he was, rather than a strategy for what he needed. That is what the gift-giving virtue actually means. Not the complete absence of need. The practice of giving in a way that is not held hostage to the outcome. Chapter 32. The eternal recurrence of generosity. The eternal recurrence, at its most useful, is a test applied not to the life in general, but to specific choices within the life. Not would I live this whole life again, but would I make this specific choice again, knowing how it turned out. Apply it tonight, gently, to the specific giving you have been carrying. Would you have helped that person, knowing they would not return it? Would you have given that year, that money, that sustained attention, knowing that the account would not be settled? Most people who lie awake running the midnight arithmetic, when they sit with this question honestly, find that the answer is yes. Not because the outcome was fair, not because they approve of what happened, but because the giving at the time was the right thing for them to do. It was what they were, and even knowing the outcome, they would not have withheld what they had to give. This is not a small thing. This is the proof that the giving was real, not arithmetic, not strategy, but the genuine expression of what you were at the time you gave it. The outcome did not invalidate the giving. The giving happened. It was real. The person received it, and the receiving changed something in their situation, even if they never acknowledged it, even if they moved on as if it had not happened. The giving happened. You cannot take it back. They cannot make it not have happened. The arithmetic is an attempt to unhappen it, to find a way to say that because it was not returned, it was therefore not worth what it cost, but it was worth what it cost, because you would do it again. This is where amor fati and the eternal recurrence converge. Not as a consolation, as a description of what actually happened. You gave what you had to give. It was given. That is done. And if you had to choose again, you would choose it again. That means you do not regret it. That means the ledger is not a ledger, it is a record of what you chose. That is a different relationship to the arithmetic than the one that runs at 2 a.m. Chapter 33. What you were looking for. We planted a third question on this night, and we have been moving toward its answer since the 10th chapter. Not why people fail to return what you give, but what you were looking for when you gave it. Here is the honest answer that Nietzsche spent his life approaching. You were looking for confirmation that you were the kind of person you hoped you were. Not in the transaction, not the exchange of favors, but in the act itself. In the moment of giving something real from what you had, you were being, for that moment, the kind of person who does that. And the self that does that gives generously without knowing whether the giving will be returned, that shows up when it is not required, that invests in someone else's situation at a cost to its own. That self is one you can live with more easily than the other options. This is not selfishness in the usual sense. It is something closer to what Frankl was describing in the camps. The self maintaining itself through the act of giving, staying coherent through the practice of choosing to give. The giving confirms not what the recipient owes you, but who you are. When the giving is not returned, the midnight arithmetic is not primarily about justice. It is about the specific fear that if the giving was not received and not valued, then maybe the self that gave it was not what you hoped it was. Maybe the kind of person you were trying to be did not make the impact you thought. Maybe the years of giving were absorbed without a trace. Maybe you were, in the end, dispensable. This fear is the deepest layer of the arithmetic. And what Nietzsche's philosophy eventually offers in response to it is this: the self that gave is not defined by what the recipient did with the giving. The self is defined by the giving, by the choosing, by the fact that when the moment came and you had something to give and someone who needed it, you gave it. That moment happened. It is permanent now, in the way that the past is permanent. The present moment always will have been. The person who gave, that was you. That is you. The receiving or not receiving does not change that. You were looking for confirmation of who you were. You have had it. The fact that you gave it is the confirmation. Let that be enough tonight. Chapter 34. The Quiet Man in the Mountain. Shorter sentences now. The night has grown deeper. Your body knows it. Let everything slow. Zarathustra goes back to the mountain, not in defeat, not because the valley did not receive him. He goes back because the mountain is where he thinks most clearly, because the silence at that altitude is the right kind of silence for the kind of thinking he does, because the solitude is not a punishment, it is a place. He is not alone in the way of a person who is longing for company. He is alone in the way of a person who has chosen the terms of their solitude. This is a different kind of alone. You know the first kind. Most nights, it is the first kind. The philosophy tonight has been pointing slowly toward the second kind. Not as a destination, as a direction. The person who gives from fullness is not isolated. They have people they love and people who love them. They have the warmth of real connection. But their sense of themselves does not depend entirely on those connections to exist. There is something inside that continues when the others are not present. Something that thinks and creates and chooses and is glad to be here even in a quiet room at the end of a long night. Nietzsche had this in his best moments: the pleasure in the Turin light, the satisfaction of the writing that no one would read for years, the walk along the Ligurian coast in the morning before the migraines arrived. Small things, present things. The mind does not need to solve tonight. It only needs to rest. Let your breath slow. Let your eyes close if they want to. The mountain is still there. The light will come. Chapter 35. The Last Virtue. In his letters from the autumn and early winter of 1888, the last months before Turin, Nietzsche wrote with something that his biographers have noted as unusual in its texture. Not the grandiosity that also appeared in those months, the belief that he was doing the most important philosophical work of the century, not the intensity that had characterized his work for 20 years. Something quieter than those. He wrote to his friend Heinrich Koselitz about Turin, about the city's beauty, the long arcaded streets, the pleasure of sitting in a particular square in the afternoon. He wrote to his publisher with genuine warmth. He wrote to his mother with a tenderness that had sometimes been obscured by the complicated history between them. He took pleasure in small things, with a specificity that suggests the pleasure was real. Whether this was the clarity of a mind approaching its limit, or whether it was something he had arrived at through the work, a genuine settling into the life as it was, is not something that can be known with certainty now. The historical record ends at Turin, but the letters from that last autumn read like a person who has finally stopped arguing with his life, not resigned to it, not defeated by it. Something more like arrived. Here is what I have. This city, this light, this ability to think and to write, these few people who will receive a letter if I send one. This is what I have. And it is, against all the arithmetic of what I gave and what I received, enough. The last virtue in Nietzsche's philosophy is not strength. It is not the will to power in the aggressive sense. It is the capacity to receive what actually exists, what is actually here, in this room, in this body, in this life as it was, rather than as you wished it had been, with something close to gladness. Not because it is perfect, because it is yours. Chapter 36. Sleep now. We return to where we began. A body in a dark room, running the arithmetic. Who you carried, who did not carry you back, and why. The arithmetic has not been solved tonight. It cannot be solved. The past is fixed. The giving happened. The returns did not come in the way you hoped they would. Those facts are not going to change by morning. But Nietzsche did not solve the arithmetic either. He lived with it for 20 years, in rented rooms in Italy and Switzerland, writing ideas that would not be read until he could no longer read them himself. He gave freely and expensively, and was not, in his own life, returned to in equal measure. And he arrived, slowly, at something other than the arithmetic. He arrived at the understanding that the giving was not the means to an end. The giving was the thing itself. The overflowing cup does not overflow in order to fill other cups. It overflows because it is full. And the full cup does not mourn the cups that could not hold what it poured. It returns to its source. It fills again. What you have given tonight, the attention you brought to these ideas, the willingness to sit with the hard questions before sleep, that was a giving without expectation. You gave your quietest hours to this. That is not nothing. 3 open questions have been answered. The 2 kinds of giving, one from fullness, one from the need to be needed, both real. One more sustainable, one pointing toward the other. The thing that happened in Turin, a man who had been giving into near silence for 20 years in a cold street in January, saw a horse that was suffering and ran to it. The compassion did not fail at the end. It broke open. What you were looking for, you were confirming who you are. And the confirmation is in the giving, not in the return. Here is what you carry into sleep tonight. You are not diminished by the unreturned giving. You are defined by it. The person who chose to give when the giving cost something, that was you. And that choosing is permanent, and it is yours, and no arithmetic can unmake it. The room is quiet. The light will come when it comes. Sleep now.
I hope you enjoyed today's philosophy lesson. I would love to hear your comments and your thoughts. Thank you.